Aang probably was a good father, but I can't imagine Katara letting him favor Tenzin over Kaya and Bumi. She would body slam Aang into his next incarnation. And I agree with that. Like we're actually in agreement. Like people who think that Aang was like some terrible father, I think they kind of just forget that Katara was a part of the whole situation there. Like, I don't know you, I don't know anybody else, but I don't know any women who like would just sit around and allow like their spouse to be a bad father. Like, especially like really good women with like really good values, like Katara. Like if Aang was like blatantly favoring Tenzin, right? Like which people try to make it seem like if he was blatantly doing it to the point where when he was going on the field trips, because like I had a guy who I was debating a couple days ago, like who was trying to say that Aang was basically like intentionally like not taking Kaya and Bumi on the trips because they weren't airbenders. Like he was intentionally doing it. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that Katara wouldn't have said something to Aang if he was doing that, right? Like anyone in that situation would have seen that that was messed up, including Aang, right? Like I'm not saying that Aang is perfect, but I can't really imagine him doing something like that. I really can't. I don't think that he would really. I think what would really happen is if he did do something like that, like Katara would step in and say something. You want to know what probably happened? Now, look, this is hearsay, but I can say this because I'm not debating, right? Like one of my rules for debates is that when you do them, if I get anyone and I debate them, one of my rules is that I refuse to debate with just hearsay. Like you have to have actual evidence. But since I'm not debating anyone, my personal feelings on what likely happened when Kaya and Bumi like got left on the trips is that they were like younger, right? So what they probably misunderstood why they got left on the trips later. I think what happened is they probably did go on some of the trips at first. He probably took all of his children, right? I imagine that he probably did. Like he did. There's no way Aang started doing this as like when Tenzin was born if like the gap between Tenzin and Boomy is like it looks like to be like almost 10 years, if not 10 years. You telling me he waited like 10 years to start showing his children anything? I don't believe that. That's kind of weird. I think what happened is Kaya and Boomy did go on some of these trips with Aang, but because they're not airbenders and because they're not interested, because they're like children, right? It's probably just super boring. It's like taking like children to like a museum or something. Like it's not that interesting to them, right? What probably happened is they weren't really interested, and Aang noticed this, and he was like, "Fine, I'm not gonna drag my kids with me around the world to these air temples when they really don't care. I mean, they're just children, right? It's better to leave them at home." And with Katara, where they can have fun, they can play, and they don't have to deal with like the serious consequences of like their lineage being completely destroyed, right? I think that's probably what happened. They just weren't that interested. But then when Tenzin did enter the picture, since Tenzin was actually an airbender, like there was an extra incentive for Tenzin to go on these things, right? Because not only would he be learning about his culture, he would be like, this would be like a learning experience for his bending, right? Like, I feel like it became that. Like, since he was like the next to last airbender, this was something that he kind of had to do to learn, right? Whereas Boomy, he's a non-bender, so it doesn't matter for him. And then Kaya, she's a waterbender. So we obviously know which parent she's gonna like need to be the closest to for that skill. She's gonna want to be the closest to her mom, right? And so I think and that's been confirmed that like she's the closest to Katara. So I really do think that that's the reason why that happened. And then you gotta remember, like, Kaya and Bumi are like in their like 50s and 60s, right? Like Kaya has to be like very late 50s, and like Bumi is probably like early to mid 60s, right? So like when they're thinking back on their childhood, they are thinking like 4 or 5 plus decades back, right? So of course they're gonna look back and look at Tenzin, who like became like this very important figure. Of course they're gonna look back and be like, you know what? I especially after their dad died, because you gotta remember he died early. He only died he died at like the biological age of like 66, basically, right? So you have to imagine that when you think about that, like that their dad died so young, and that they probably didn't have like all the time in the world to ask him questions and stuff, because that would have been super unexpected. That like as this like the years and the decades went on, they started looking back on things with like a different scope, right? Because you gotta remember, like they're siblings, but they haven't been around each other a lot. Like Boomy has been a commander for decades, right? Which means that he was always somewhere else in the world. So he wasn't like very close to his siblings. And then Kaya, she also traveled the world, and Tenzin travels the world all the time. So these siblings, right? Like think to your own siblings, right? Like once you grow up, there's not a lot of cases where you're in the same place that much. Like I'm even seeing that with my own siblings where we don't have as much in common, and like we're not in the same place that much really ever again, right? Like we're not that far apart. Like we're not in different continents and stuff, but you have to think about it that way. Like Kaya, Bumi, Tenzin are like on different continents from each other all the time for years, decades, right? They're probably only really bumping into each other and seeing each other like once, twice, maybe 3 times a decade, right? So they're not the closest, right? Like that builds time for them to get more and more different and to build like resentment, basically, right? So to me, it makes sense that when they're all back together after being gone for so long, that when they think back, they're not gonna be looking back at the past with like rose tinted glasses. They're probably gonna be making the past a little bit more negative than it really was, and they're probably gonna be taking some things out of context. Like you gotta think about it this way. Like they were all doing it, like, but in different ways. Like Kaya and Boomy, what I think they were doing basically is that Kaya and Boomy were basically taking the past out of context by making it seem like Tenzin was like like the main person that Aang focused on, right? And I think the reason they're doing that is because when you look at Tenzin, Tenzin basically looks at Aang as if he was perfect. And like Kaya actually like she calls him out on it. She's like, yeah, our childhood wasn't perfect. Like, and I think it's okay to say that. Like it's okay for her to be like, yeah, my dad was not perfect. She's not saying that he was terrible. She's just saying that he wasn't perfect, because if you ask Tenzin about Aang, he's not gonna say a single negative thing, right? That's what the problem there was. And it's like I think that they kind of overcompensated or overshot for trying to show how flawed their dad really was by bringing up some things that didn't happen, right? Like, yeah, or at least changing the context of it, right? Like the context of like those trips and stuff, I think was what I said is basically that they didn't want to go on the trips, or they just weren't very interested, and so they got left behind. It really wasn't because he was doing it out of maliciousness. He was doing it because like who wants to drag their kids somewhere they don't want to go, right? Like, I think about it, like when we were kids, right? Think about like the places that adults would drag you when you were a kid, basically, right? Like whenever like your grandparents or your parents would drop you off at like a relative's house that you didn't know very well, or you'd have to wait for them if they went to like, I don't know, like to get a haircut or to get like their hair done somewhere like in a salon, or if they went into like one of those really boring stores, right? Think about it, being a kid, you didn't want to be there. Like it was the most boring thing ever. Like when they take you to like the doctor and you just have to wait in the office. That's like the most boring thing ever. I swear, if you think about some of those moments, like if you could have stayed home, you probably would have, right? But then think about that feeling like you don't want to go to this very boring place, but one of your siblings always wants to go, right? And so whenever like your parent goes to like the doctor or to this boring place, the kid who wants to go, right? Like the kid who's interested, he always goes and you stay behind, right? So if the parent becomes a little bit closer to that kid because they're always around, I don't think that's the best thing in the world, but I think like what did you expect? It's not because they're an airbender, right? I don't think that Aang likes Tenzin so much because he was an airbender. He did it because they spent the most time together. He still loved all of his children, right? Like you got to think about it. Like he had time with with Boomy longer than he had with any other kids because he's the oldest. No one ever brings that up, but like there was a like if you look at the like very clear big gap between even him and Kaya, like there's a big gap between even those two, and they're the oldest, right? There's got to be at least a 5 year gap, if not more, right? So in that 5 year gap where that's like the only kid they have, like how are you gonna sit there and act like Aang didn't do the best that he could? Aang didn't care that Boomy wasn't a bender. He loved him the same. Now I know I kind of went on a tangent here, but like that's really how I feel about it. Is that like my problem with that scene is that the Legend of Korra has so many problems, right? It has so many objective problems that you can't write yourself out of. It has so many things in it that like people just straight up don't like or break the world or whatever. All those problems that are legitimate in my opinion, but then the only thing, but then like the hugest problem in the show is Aang was a bad dad. And that's not even like what they were trying to go for. Like not only have the creators Mike and Brian come out and said that's not what they were trying to go for, but I really don't see how you could get that from the episode unless you're just like remembering something from the past or you just read a post. And I think that like 95% of the people who say this saw it online somewhere after the show, or they only saw the show like years ago and they're just remembering it wrong, just like Kaya and Boomy are, right? I think that's the real culprit behind it is that people don't go back and check, right? Because if you go back and you watch the full episode, you'll know that like, the theme of the episode is supposed to be like civil disputes. It's literally called civil wars, right? It's about like the North versus the South, Kaya and Bumi versus Tenzin, and what is it? Like Janora Milo versus Iki, right? It's supposed to be about that, but you'll notice that like all of those things are resolved. Like the point was just supposed to be that yes, sometimes you have these big disagreements with people that you love, but it doesn't mean that the people you love are bad people in every case. And so in a lot of cases it does, but not in every case. Like we don't need to go there every time, in my opinion. Right? And like at no point do any of his kids ever say that he was a bad dad either. They never say it. The closest you'll get is Kaya like kind of implying that he wasn't perfect, but that's as far as she goes. Right? And like if you were to talk to her about anything else regarding her dad, she would have nothing but positive things to say. Right? Like for instance, like my mother, right? Me and my mother have had a whole lot of disagreements, even recently, right? And there's a lot of aspects of my mom that I don't like. I'll be honest about it. Like I'm not gonna go into detail or anything, but I don't like everything about my mom. I really don't. But that being said, I think it would be disingenuous for me to say that she was a bad mother, right? And that's it. I think that would just be incredibly disingenuous and incredibly wrong. Like good people do bad things, just like bad people do good things. Right? Like just because my mother has done bad things or because I've been hurt by her actions doesn't mean that every single thing she did was bad. Making a couple mistakes does not make a person bad. Like what makes a person bad is making these mistakes and then never learning from them. Right? Making these mistakes and never apologizing for them. Right? That's what really makes a person a bad person, in my opinion. Is when, cause like if Kaya or Boomy had ever like confronted Aang about their feelings, I bet you he would have felt terrible, right? Like I don't think he would have made an excuse about it. I think he would have thought back to it, and even if what I said was right about how they weren't really interested, I still think he would have apologized, and I still think he would have realized that he did mess up at least in some way, right? Like I don't think any fan would believe that Aang would be stubborn enough to not do that. And if he wasn't, that means he wasn't a bad dad now, doesn't it? And that's really all I'm getting at is that like we know Aang is not a bad person, so why would he be a bad dad? Like, come on. Now, some people when they say that, what they really mean is that he was a bad dad, like in terms of being a parent. I feel like that's a little bit more fair. It's a little bit harder to argue against. But at the same time, right? Like at the same time, the dude was the freaking avatar. Like when people say this, like, does that just mean that like people who have parents who serve, say, in the Army, Navy, Air Force, or whatever, right? Does that make them bad parents? Are all of them bad parents now? Because that's basically what you would have to say is that any parent who has some sort of higher responsibility that makes it so that they can't 100% be present in their children's lives. If you're gonna get on to Aang, who has to do that, then like why wouldn't you call someone who serves in the army but has children? Why would you call them a bad parent? Why wouldn't you call any parent who has to do like work, like a job, right? Any parent who isn't like 100% around their kids at every possible point, right? Because of some responsibility they have to do. Why not call them bad parents? Like, why not? I don't think anyone would ever do that. And the reason why is because of something called cognitive dissonance, right? Like these people recognize the nuance there when someone's like serving in the military, but they don't want to apply that same nuance to Avatar, right? I guess in their head, they think that Aang should have just been a bad Avatar, stayed at home on his ass, and raised the kids like 100% of the time. Like he should have just been there 100% of the time and not off making sure the world didn't explode, right? Making sure that there was a world for his children to grow up in, right? No, that's what he should have been doing, right? It's not like he didn't have like a wife, right? It's not like he didn't have a bunch of friends. And it's also not like the dude probably did have times when the world wasn't going crazy and he did spend a lot of time with them. Right? It's not like that, right? Because here's another point. I don't think any of these people are ever gonna bring up the fact that since Aang is the Avatar, there were probably a lot of times where he had to leave Tenzin in like behind really like suddenly, right? Tenzin probably wouldn't like hold that against him, but I guarantee you there were times where he was doing something with Tenzin and he had to leave abruptly, right? Like I think people just want him to be a bad dad. Like I've seen videos that like there's one video that says that Legend of Korra made Aang a bad dad and I loved it or whatever. And I'm like, I didn't watch the video, but I'm guessing the reason they love it is because they think that Aang being a bad dad makes him more complex. When honestly, I would disagree. I would think that the more complex person would be the person who, despite those odds, wasn't a bad dad, right? Not the person who, because of those odds, was, right? Like, I think, like, with an avatar, right? They're never really gonna have true successes when it comes to, like, personal stuff, right? It's all at best probably gonna be, like, compromises and half measures, basically, right? I don't think you can be the avatar and 100% be there for like your wife, your children, like your friends. I don't think you really can, right? Like, you can still have those things, but it's never gonna be like a normal person, right? And I think that's fine because people in the real world are like that, and nobody hates them. Nobody thinks they're a bad dad. So yeah, that's really how I feel about that. Like Aang wasn't a good dad. Like in terms of like Aang wasn't the greatest person to have for a dad. Like I don't think anyone can really disagree with that because of his position. But at the same time, I do think that Aang wasn't a bad dad. He was just an imperfect person, right? Like everyone else. Cause look, you can be there for your kids 100%, right? And still be a bad dad. Just like you can have a lot of distance from your children and still be a good dad. Like that's what I like about this writing. Like this is one of the best pieces of writing in literary horror for me because like of how nuanced it is. Like as much as I hate that people have just immediately decide to crap on Aang because of it. At the very least, I do appreciate that the writing was left open enough so that you can have people who are on like all three extremes and in between, right? You can have people who think he's a bad dad. You can have people who think he was a great, perfect dad. And you can have people who are somewhere in the middle, like me. Anytime like something like that happens, I think that's actually indicative of very good writing. Because it makes you think. Like this sticks with people.